Welcome to the global phenomenon, Surviving the Survivor, where we're all just trying to survive in a rough world.
Holocaust was ever present in my life growing up. However, today, it is not the haunting presence it once was. Rather, it has become for me an ongoing awareness of carrying our ancestors' stories, carrying their lives with us, teaching us lessons in resilience and optimism. Therefore, I am delighted to introduce to you our speakers, Mrs. Karmela Waldman, a trained therapist and Holocaust survivor, and her son, Joel Waldman, who is an Emmy Award-winning broadcast journalist. They have a podcast, the only mother and son podcast that I know of. It's a little irreverent, very honest, and exceedingly funny. It is cleverly called Surviving the Survivor. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. Karmela, as I call her, also mom. She is always training me my whole life and just now said, don't make this entertaining in any way. Speak to the audience. So usually I start off with a joke, but I won't. But we do host a weekly podcast called Surviving the Survivor. The tagline for the show is Surviving the Rough World. And obviously everyone can relate to that, what we've been through over the last couple of years. Everyone, in some degree or another, is dealing with some issue in their life, either presently, in the past, or at some point in the future. And we kind of take, as Lisa said, irreverent look at that. We do this weekly, we have a lot of guests. We just had an entire show about Elon Musk. But tonight is obviously remembering all those who perished in the Holocaust. And just as a little background, my mother and I, even in our family, we never really talked about it very much at all. I didn't really know her story until a few years after I graduated from Brandeis University. That's when we first started to talk about it. And then the pandemic happened, and I found myself without a lot to do, and my mother in the same boat, and we said, hey, she's 82, I'm 52, let's start a podcast. Then it was 81 and 51. And so we started doing that, and through the podcast, I actually learned a lot about her story. And every time I talk to her, I learned something completely different. And that's why we kind of, when we speak to people, we do it sort of in interview style. So without further, the other thing is, I want to make this interactive. I don't want people falling asleep on us. So if you have questions, you want to interject, just raise your hand and feel free to jump in. But without further ado, Mom, if you want to just tell us, you were born in Subotica, Yugoslavia in 1939. She has a booming voice, so she's not going to need the mic. I'll put it down here. Just tell us what life was like then, and eventually where it likes you.
I was born in August of 1939, and the war started really in September, so it was perfect timing. And we lived in this small town right on the border between Hungary and Yugoslavia. And there's a little, let me just digress already. We interviewed a 102-year-old Ben Ferenc, actually using Ben Ferenc, can you hear me? And Ben Ferenc is the last surviving prosecutor of the Nuremberg trials. And he was boasting that in the same bed when he was born, it was two different countries at different times, the same town. Well, when I was born, it was 3 different countries at 3 different times, so I told him I'm living here. And we had a very middle-class life in this small town. And my father was a professional, what they would call today optometrist. He studied in Germany to chisel lenses. And we lived very peacefully. In 1941, Yugoslavia, where I was born, became Hungary. It was occupied by the Nazi Hungarians. But it was a sort of uneventful.
This happened on the podcast too.
Yeah, he's always yelling at you that not holding his close. Okay. So in 1941, it became part. The Yugoslavs were overrun by the Nazis, the Germans and the Hungarians. And our town was occupied by the Hungarians, but it was relatively quiet. And the irony of life is that they put us in the ghetto, but they did not really, it was a ghetto light. And my father was permitted to go out, to go to his eyeglass store, because there was a need for that. There were only two in town, both owned by Jews. And so my father would leave to go walk out of the ghetto every morning. And my mother obtained false documents to go to Hungary to disappear, because in our town, it was a small town and people knew us. They were mostly dark-haired people. My mother was a natural blonde. That's why I'm a fake one. And they would recognize us. We couldn't disappear, but in Budapest, which was considered a big city of 2 million people, and we had false documents. But my father said he will not let me go with my mother because he studied in Germany and he knows the German culture, that they are the most civilized, sophisticated people, and maybe they will make us work, but nothing worse, so he doesn't. In other words, he was totally denying reality. Then we were in the ghetto in 1944, June 16, which was already a time when some of Europe was liberated. This is the irony on top of the irony. So we were in the ghetto, and somebody let my father know, the mayor with whom my father used to play cards, it was a small town, whose wife was Jewish, warned my father that the next morning they are going to take us to the train station and put us in cattle cars and take us somewhere unknown. The unknown was Auschwitz. And so they didn't undress. My father, mother, grandmother, and grandfather and I, almost 5-year-old, very precocious at that time. They told me I didn't develop at the same speed later, but I was pretty, I was a little old lady at 5. So we all slept in our clothes, and sure enough, in the morning they knocked on our door, the Hungarian Nazis, I have to emphasize. And they said in nice Hungarian that they want our jewelry and they want our money, and we should make a little suitcase and they'll come and collect us to take us to the train station. At that moment, my father started to ask my mother, whose name was Vera, says, Vera, please do something. Like he woke up. And my mother took my hand, and we were in the ghetto, but it was put in a place where there were little houses. It wasn't apartments. It was a rural area. It's agricultural area. So we were in a house, and my mother took me by the hand, and through the backyard there was a little door, and she just started to walk with me. And my father, grandmother, grandfather stayed in the house, and they didn't go with us, and we left. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but interestingly, my mother my mother was a school teacher, and in teacher school, she had these Gentile friends, close friends, and she knocked on the window, and this woman did not open her door when she saw us. Then she went further and knocked at another friend's door that she knew about, window. The windows were like street height. And the second one opened the door, let us in. She accompanied my mother and myself to a general ophthalmologist who used to in the past work with my father. He was a very religious Christian eye doctor, and we knocked on his door. He didn't know we were coming. He opened his door, he let us in, and he went over to the nuns. There were no phones. So he walked over to the nuns. The nuns were, he was a benefactor of these nuns, who were also from Croatia, like he was originally. And he explained to them who we are, what is going on, and so forth. And the nun superior said, we'll take her. My mother was afraid to take me with her, with the false documents. She was afraid to take me to her on the train because she was afraid that they would recognize me in the train station or recognize her. So she felt safer leaving me there. And so I was taken, they told my mother to wait until it gets dark. And in the dark, my mother took me to these nuns and left me with them. And according to what I heard, this I don't remember saying, I said, I was screaming at the top of my lungs that a mother who loves her child doesn't leave her with strangers. And then 6 months later, this was June 16th, and I was with the nuns for 6 months. They were very nice to me. They assigned one of the nuns to take care of me. The Mother Superior was a very warm, very full of life person who played the piano and sang and was a very good person. And they loved me, they took care of me, but I was very withdrawn, very pale. And my mother was beginning to be very anxious in Budapest. The war was still raging in Budapest. And it wasn't yet liberated. But she bribed a railroad person who was related to the guy who was working in my father's store, and he brought me up from the nuns to my mother. The whole trip is 2 hours by train, from my house, Subotica, to Budapest. So when we arrived to Budapest, my mother was horrified how pale I was, how skinny I was, and there was famine in Budapest. There was famine in Budapest. What I did, I Googled.
Not back then.
Not back then. And just very recent. It turns out that a few days after they brought me up there, the siege of Budapest began by the Russians. But here is the irony. It's documented. You can all Google 1945 siege of Budapest. And it's documented there that when the siege began, it lasted 50 days. 50 days of bombardment, sniping, artillery, famine. And my mother was like a very delicate blood, very sensitive person, would take a big knife and go out in the street. It was winter, it was snowing, and the shelling from the artillery, the transportation, all the transportation was in horse buggies and the tramways. So the horses would be hit by shelling, and they would drop dead in the snow. And the snow was not even a very nice snow, it was like a little grayish snow. And my mother would cut pieces out of the dead horses, and she wasn't the only one. There was a whole group of people who were cutting out meat from the dead horses. And buildings were collapsing from the bombardments. And this turns out it lasted 50 days. And not long ago, we spoke with some people from the Ukraine, and this part I could compare to what they are going through. And I felt it kind of brought back that, I thought you were because usually when we
This is the best interview I've ever done. I asked one question. TV news, you get a minute 30, every story is about a minute and 30 seconds. So it'd be great because I'd have to ask one question, but then I'd have to edit it down from 40 straight minutes. But let's talk about Ukraine for a minute. So on the podcast, we actually spoke to a young couple that, history repeats itself, obviously.
But not entirely. I made it a tremendous.
I'll let you get into it. But we were, we're watching this unfold in real time on CNN and other networks. And I had spoken to some people in Ukraine and for interview purposes, and met a couple, and they were hiding in their laundry room. They actually could still be there. They were there for over a month at one point. We had them live on the podcast. But these questions came up to my mother, the comparisons, and my mother gets, as you just saw, very defensive because there are comparisons to be made, but differences as well. So Karmela, here's another 50 minutes.
I felt really shook up. I tell you, before I go there, I have to tell you that I Googled the siege of Budapest. And it turns out it was the Soviet Union that liberated us. And the units that liberated us from the Soviet Union were Ukrainian units. So I felt it was like uncanny that the army, the part of the Russian Red Army that liberated us was actually Ukrainian. Okay? I'm not reading too much into this, but that's what happened. So just by looking at their buildings and the destruction of their buildings and the way Budapest looked at that time, we all lived in the basement. Okay, in Budapest, because for 50 days they were shelling and bombarding and sniping, and it was really very, very, very dangerous. Once and my mother would not leave me in the building. If she went out to try to find food, she took me with her because she was like afraid that she would come back and I wouldn't be there anymore. And we were crossing the bridges were all destroyed during the siege on the Danube. There were 7 bridges, they were all destroyed. But at that time, they weren't all destroyed, and we were on a bridge. And the husband and the wife were walking towards us, and the husband collapsed, and my mother saw that it was a sniper that killed the husband. So this was the scene, and then we all moved down to the basement. And those are huge Budapest apartment buildings that are like 6-story high and like long. And everybody you were permitted to bring, 4 people were permitted to bring down one bed. 4 people had to sleep in one bed. We slept there, the whole building slept in the basement. Probably the whole of Budapest slept in the basement. But the problem with us, our family, was that we were Jewish, and they were not. And they were not nice sometimes, and there was always the danger that somebody would wonder, how did these people pop into this building? They don't live here. What are they? Who are they? And then, here is where I became the hero, and I love to tell this story. I learned the Christian prayers. I knew who I was at the age of 5.5. I knew exactly who I was. But I learned the Christian prayers from the nuns. And I would go next to the bed and say in the loudest possible, or maybe that's where I got my loud voice. And I said these prayers, Christian prayers, which assured us that they will not suspect us. So that was one of the ways that we got through that period of time.
Do you remember them?
Well, I remember some others, but not those, not the Christian ones. I know what they.
She's saying that to the rabbis right here.
No, I remember the one that my mother told me right after the liberation in Hungarian. Anyone who speaks Hungarian can witness it. Because I had nightmares. I mean, it's not surprising, but I had nightmares. And then she told me a little rhyming prayer, and it really happened with my nightmare. That one I still remember.
I think this is an important point because I don't remember hearing this, and it's like a game of telephone. Over time, stories change. They get a little embellished maybe, or not embellished, and I think that's why it's so important. Not you, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is it's very important to document these stories.
No, but
We do this all the time, by the way, this is not just for you. It's actually much worse, fine.
on our podcast. Much.
But I think that's why it's so important for young people. I see a bunch of
No, but
other people
where is
to hear these stories.
Oren is here.
Oren is here,
Oren
yes.
heard me the other place, and he can tell if it was very different.
He's over there.
Oh.
Or does it sound familiar?
Not as many jokes.
So let's
No, this is I told Joel, remember, this is a solemn occasion, but unfortunately, we developed this relationship of sick jokes and constantly, using black humor.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
Later in life, did you ever ask your mother why she left you? Did that ever come up?
I just gave the reason. She was afraid to get me into the train.
I understand the reason, but did you ever,
No,
you
that's
said no mother that loves her child would leave her. Did you ever approach her about that?
No, but when I was taken up to Budapest in January, and the siege in December, and the siege started right then, she told me that I was very bizarre. I was very withdrawn. And I was very quiet, and I was very pale. And when we were lying, four of us in the bed, because we had an aunt and a cousin, we were actually six of us. So the other part of the story. But I wouldn't touch anybody's body. I literally I was a skinny little thing, but I was sort of stuck to the wall so that I wouldn't have I guess that's what I learned from the nuns too. That's when I began being bizarre.
And when did you find out what had happened to your father?
Okay, my father, we are from this town. We had 5,000 Jews before the war. When the war was over, in March, we started our way back to Subotica, the town where we are from. And it took us 2 weeks. I could just do a story about the trip back because I vaguely remember the slush, the snow, where we slept, how we had to climb up on trucks. And 2 weeks it took us to get the 2-hour train trip from Budapest to Subotica. When we got back, some of the other members, 5,000 Jews before the war, and they were taken away virtually before the end. And so they were very, relatively, they weren't away for so long, but they were immediately killed, and only 1,200 came back out of the 5,000. And one of the people who didn't come back was my father. And they were witnesses, and my grandfather was the other one. And they were witnesses who saw them arrive to Auschwitz. And my father was, I heard these stories from my mother because I don't really remember my father, but my father was a very optimistic, upbeat person. And he was always seeing the good things to the point of it killed him. When he arrived to Auschwitz, he walked over to the guard, and there were witnesses. There were absolutely witnesses in our community who reported it back out the door. And he said to the guard in the best German, because he studied to chisel eyeglasses, he said to him, I may be of use to you because I have this professional skill. And God immediately put him in the line for the crematorium. When my grandfather was coming with him, they were traveling together to Auschwitz, he was standing there, he joined him. And that's how they were both killed at the same time.
And how did you, by the way, Subotica has, I think, the second biggest shul in all of Europe, the beautiful synagogue.
Yeah, I think I'm doing pre-advertising for Google, but Google the synagogue in Subotica. Google the synagogue in Subotica.
Now let me ask you, thank God my father is still here at 88. How did you process losing your father at that age?
And then, when this happened in Subotica, not only Jews, but there were virtually no Jews. And the people who were in Subotica, there were a lot of people without fathers. There were a lot of people. There were probably in my class equal number of kids with fathers than without fathers. So I didn't really get it until later when I saw what it means to have a father. Now I was in a certain way lucky because my mother married a Jewish man whose pregnant wife and son were killed in Auschwitz. So this father, my father, was a wonderful man, and he really took on a lot of the tasks of fathering me until I was about almost 10-year-old when my little sister invaded my territory, and she was born, and then he paid a lot of more attention to her. At least that's what I felt.
One more quick thing, and I think then we should open it up to questions. You have 8 beautiful grandchildren, only 1 grandson, courtesy of me.
Oh my God, he never misses saying this.
And
He knows my daughter is watching this. So glad to do it, to annoy her.
what do you want to make sure that they know or understand or learn from you?
But as much as
Outside of cursing, by the way, there are many other cursing.
I think that the fact that I do believe, this is my, everybody has their life scripts, they make their idea of what happened in their lives. I think I truly believe that my father was killed by his optimism, okay? He was so optimistic and so positive that he went over to this guy. He could have lived. He was a young man. It was 8 months, and he just because he also was very influenced by the Germany he knew in the early 30s before Hitler, so that he thought he knew the Germans, and he was like. But what I feel that I got out of all this is that sort of maybe it's genetic, maybe it's something like that. I'm also optimistic, I cannot help it. I am optimistic. I always think things will get better.
And I veer towards pessimism, so I learned the lesson. But I think we should take, do you have questions?
How long did you live in the town when you went back with your mother?
6 months exactly, 6 months.
And where did you go after?
I went to the private in the basement for 15
When you came back, this is what.
Oh, this is the whole other story of our Jewish existence. In 1948, Tito, who was the communist leader of Yugoslavia, and had a Jewish intellectual who was his friend during the war, Moshe Piade. Moshe Piade talked him into opening the street. I think I rewrote history, but this is more or less accurate. He let the Jews out of Yugoslavia when the state of Israel was formed. And we had our container, we were putting things in it to emigrate to Israel. And my sister, my mother couldn't conceive after the war, and she conceived just when we were ready to go, and the war broke out in Israel, and they backed out. So that we stayed there until I finished high school. I finished high school in Subotica. I'm very proud usually to say probably the worst high school in the Western world. Eastern of Europe, you know.
Any other questions?
Did your parents hear anything about what was happening in other countries, or was it total shock to hear it happening?
This is a question I asked also. By the way, I have to tell you that my stepfather's last name was Senesh.
Oh,
I was not related. And I knew about the Karms Senesh. He's unbelievable hero. And I'm glad you knew him. This was an excellent Anyway, what was the You know, I have a senior moment that if he asks me or some other subject, he has to remind me. I'm not embarrassed today.
Did your parents hear about anything that was happening before?
They were in denial. I think that's how, because the life there was more or less provincial, peaceful. The Gentiles weren't nasty to the Jews. Everything was, even when the Hungarian Nazis took over, they were like Hungarians. They spoke, my parents spoke Hungarian. My mother was born in Budapest. And they spoke Hungarian. So and I think they loved themselves. And when they heard bad things, they denied it. Or something, because it was so far in the war that they had to know what was going on. And my father had to, he was not a stupid man, he was just like naive. I don't know what's going on. I don't know the whole psychology of that. I now go around and preach that naivete kills. You know, that if you are too naive, you can die from something. If you're too optimistic, you can die from that. Basically, you can die from everything.
Did you ever meet up with anybody from your childhood at a later time? Have you ever met up with anybody from your childhood at a later time, a later date?
Oh yeah, I went back for my 50th high school reunion. Yes, I did. Yes, I did. You have to understand, this little town is a crazy place. Okay. I love this. There are Hungarians, there are Serbians, there are Croats, there are a sect called the Bunjevac. It's a little, there is a little tolerance between the people, otherwise they couldn't live there. So I was always, when we did, every beginning of the year they asked, for some reason they still ask, communism or no communism, it was communism. They would ask, how many Serbs? The Serbs would raise their hands. We started in Serbo-Croatian. How many Croats? They raised their hands. How many Hungarians? And then they said, how many others? And yours truly was the only one that was always the other.
How many people were at the reunion?
At the reunion, all those who didn't die. I would say that they were about 80%. And it was nice. We went on for a few days. There was a little ceremony in the high school. And
She's the one that told me not to be entertaining. She does find a lot.
I want to be the only one.
She has gone through life with a lot of black humor. I think that's important too. That's helped her get through. I don't want to depress you guys, but
No.
she lost a son as well, which we talk about.
The podcast.
So she's been through a lot, but she's always still finds the energy to yell at me.
But right now I'm having a little hard time because my husband who was a psychiatrist. He is unfortunately now in a wheelchair, not well, and so it's a little tough now. But we still are.
He's doing fine.
Any other questions?
Questions? In the back?
When you went back to your village, were you welcomed? Was your home still there? Because a lot of people are staying back to the drums. How was it when you came back?
Believe it or not, because you see, when they took us, the Jews of Subotica in the freight trains to Auschwitz, that was in June. By October, the Russians liberated Subotica. So we were literally killed like 3 months before the end. So by the time we came back, after October, the following March, it was already, there were Russian soldiers in the hospitals. They were dancing the national dances in the park. It was already communism. And the people were, to us personally, very, very, very nice.
One more question?
Yeah, hi. How did you end up in America?
How did I end up getting permission? Well, it's a long story. but the true story is that my mother had one brother, and that brother was studying to be a rabbi in Vienna. When the war started, he went to France, and then he became a rabbi, and he became a rabbi in Switzerland, believe it or not. And that's how he survived. And then, when I was in high school, my mother and him corresponded, and they said, you have to go to Switzerland to study at the university to meet a nice Jewish husband. No, doctor was not. No, that was not the requirement. My mother, to make the long story short, I did exactly that. After I finished high school, I moved in with my uncle and my aunt, and I started to study at the University of Geneva. And at that time, American Jewish boys from New York had a hard time getting to, he was accepted to dental school, and for technical reasons he wasn't agile. He couldn't, and then he went to Switzerland. And I met him.
Thank you so much. One final shameless plug, Surviving the Survivors, anywhere you listen to podcasts. However, we are super close to 500 subscribers on YouTube, and when we get there, we get special privileges. And I will know if you don't subscribe, because I know exactly how many subscribers we have. So when you leave here, even now, you can phone, YouTube, Surviving the Survivor, please subscribe. Karmela will be forever indebted, and you can listen to her for all eternity.